season again.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And it's time for gnashing of teeth about terrible special teams play by the New York Giants, I guess. But we'll
It's a
get to
tradition.
that. Yes, it is. It's a tradition. We'll get to that. We'll get to a lot more as we just talk about impressions of Friday night's game. But Tony, let's start with something a little more positive. Let's start with Tommy DeVito,
Sure.
former Syracuse, former Illinois quarterback. And anybody that listens to my shows, that reads my stuff on Big Blue View, anybody that listened to my appearance the other day on Pat Traina's Locked On Giants podcast knows that I haven't exactly been complimentary of Tommy DeVito. And I challenged him the other day on Patty's podcast. I challenged him to prove me wrong. And last night he took a big step toward doing that. That's the best I've seen DeVito. Your thoughts on watching DeVito last night?
Well, maybe some guys just step up on game day. They don't practice well, and but they play well, right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought DeVito. I mean, maybe great is too strong a word to use, but considering the circumstances that he was facing last night, namely a backup offensive line that was just awful most of the game, and he was under pressure consistently. I thought he showed good pocket presence, stepping up to avoid the rush sometimes, and getting passes off, completing a number of passes, and understanding. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but maybe understanding game situations a little bit, and kind of knowing what to do with the ball in particular situations. And I came out of that game thinking to myself, well, he looks like a viable QB3. I mean, we're not asking too much of a QB3, and maybe you'd rather have one of the more ballyhooed prospects that the Giants, could have drafted but chose not to draft last year. But I've seen worse. If you look a couple of years back at who the Giants had as depth at quarterback, Tommy DeVito does not look worse than what the Giants had a couple of years ago. I'll say that.
No, he definitely does not look worse than Jake Fromm. Let's put it that way. I thought that in his game review, in his things that we learned, I thought that Chris went a little overboard Friday night, saying that he showed enough that a year from now, the Giants could get rid of Tyrod Taylor and DeVito could be QB2. I think it's way too soon to go there, but I have been saying all along that even what I wrote on Friday was DeVito, I gave him the practice squad quarterback spot by default because there wasn't anybody else. And I thought Friday night that what he did was show that he could actually be a viable alternative for that job.
Yeah, I mean, he looked better to me, for example. If you want to just do a direct comparison, he looked better to me than Nate Sudfeld did. And Nate Sudfeld's been around for several years, as Giants fans well remember from 2020 final game of the season, and doesn't look like Nate Sudfeld has progressed much as a quarterback since that time. And so DeVito, just kind of playing for the first time, I thought outplayed him under worse circumstances than Sudfeld had to face.
And I did think that if you compare first half to second half, when, yes, the Giants were still playing a sort of makeshift backup offensive line, but at least they were playing guys who we know will be on the roster for the most part, with the exception maybe of Corey Cunningham. But he was actually he was throwing to guys like Cole Beasley and Jamison Crowder, and it looked like actual NFL offense. So,
right.
So that was a good thing. Really good, really positive night for Tommy DeVito. Other than rookie center John Michael Schmitz, not a really good night for the offensive line. I mean, if you want to wake up on this Saturday morning as we do this show and be happy, Just think about the fact that John Michael Schmitz looked like a viable starting NFL center, and forget about the rest of the guys that played offensive line last night.
Yeah, I thought it was, for the most part, horrendous. I mean, Corey Cunningham played about as poorly as I think it's possible to play, except that Wyatt Davis was even worse. But at least Wyatt Davis gets a little mulligan because they made him play tackle last night, and he's not a tackle; he's a guard. So you can say, well, okay, tackle's a harder position to play, and it's not his actual position. But Wyatt Davis certainly did not do anything to give you confidence that he can actually function in the NFL. But Corey Cunningham, I mean, looks to me like somebody who's got to be waived pretty soon because he showed absolutely nothing all night.
No, you're right, and I think that people also have been jumping up and down about Matt Peart lately, and some people think he has to make the roster. I think he's a bubble player. I didn't think he was all that good last night. Comparatively, when you look at Wyatt Davis and when you look at what Corey Cunningham did, comparatively, he looked fine, but he really didn't play all that well. I think that what people are forgetting is the third tackle on the New York Giants is Tyree Phillips. Tyree Phillips played good football in, I think, 5 starts last year for the Giants in relief of Evan Neal. There's nothing to suggest that Tyree Phillips will not make the Giants roster in 2023. He got banged up during the joint practices. He didn't play last night. At best, to me, whoever makes the roster out of that group of Peart, Cunningham, Devery Hamilton, who's another guy who is a real actual NFL tackle, who was banged up and didn't play last night. Whoever makes the Giants roster out of that group, if any of them do, is at best offensive tackle 4 for the Giants. So I'm just not going to flip out about it. And I did give Wyatt Davis a wet willy last night, but he does deserve some, he does deserve a little bit of a break, because I don't think he's even practiced there. I think it was just, somebody's got to go out there, and we'll stick Davis out there because he's not making the roster anyway. so, but it was ugly. What concerned me a little bit more about the offensive line play, Tony, was that in the first half, when Josh Azudu was at left guard and Ben Bredesen was at right guard, neither one of those players looked all that good. I think Bredesen gave up a sack last night. I don't know if he was officially charged with giving up a sack, but I didn't think, and I think Ben Bredesen played well for the Giants last year. I think they like Josh Azudu, but I didn't think either one of those guys distinguished themselves last night at all.
Yeah, well, that's what I felt as well. I was going to bring that up if you didn't. I thought their play was very disappointing last night. I say, especially Bredesen, who looks like he's had a pretty good camp, and I thought was settling in at one of the 2 guard positions. I mean, if you watched last night, you basically saw kind of an arrow-shaped protection shell for Tommy DeVito, with John Michael Schmitz mostly holding his ground at the point, but the 2 sides kind of collapsing the back on either end. And while that was mainly a tackle problem, it was partly a guard problem too for the Giants. And by comparison to the Lions, who are also playing their backups, the Lions' offensive line actually gave Sudfeld some time, part of the time, not all the time. They didn't play great either, but they clearly played better to me overall than the Giants' line did. And this is something to me that's really, really worrisome about the Giants is not just the starting offensive line, where you kind of hope that things are starting to fill in a little bit, and we cross our fingers that Evan Neal takes a big step up and becomes at least an adequate right tackle this year. But you also kind of hope that the depth fills in too, because you know that you're going to need depth on the offensive line during a football season. I mean, those guys play the most physical, punishing position in the game, I think, and you know that they're going to get hurt, and you hope that there are capable backups that can fill in. And so not only the players you mentioned that I think have been disappointing, but even like somebody like Jack Anderson, for example, just to pick out a random person who I was actually thrilled when the Giants picked him up from the Eagles, because he had a fairly good rep and was thought to be somebody who had a future in the NFL. Well, he also looked awful last night during the time that he was in there. And yeah, I say, well, where are they going to find this gem for the offensive line that nobody else knew about, but they knew about? And I'm not seeing it yet. And I think the offensive line is still a very big question mark going in. Granted, I'm overreacting because it was the backups last night, but still, you want to see that depth, and I don't think they have it.
Yeah, I just, for starters, I want to see better play from Mizzouto and Bredesen. I was disappointed by that last night. I know Brian Daboll was disappointed by some of their inability to get a yard on a few occasions when they needed a yard. And, and that was with Mizzouto and Bredesen and Schmitz in the game. And that wasn't on Schmitz. Mm-hmm. That was more on the guards. I think the Giants are okay through 7 offensive linemen. If you look at it, if you want to call, if you look at Tyree Phillips as one of the backups, you look at either Mizzouto or Bredesen, I think they'll be okay through 7. I was disappointed with what those 2 guys did last night. Very, very curious to see what happens in the coming days and over the last couple of preseason games. Very curious to watch Marcus McKethan, 5th-round pick out of North Carolina a year ago, missed all of last year with a torn ACL, came off PUP the other day, and the Giants didn't play him last night as he kind of ramps up. Kind of unfair to throw a guy into game conditions just a couple days after he comes off the PUP list. Very curious to see what McKethan can do, to see if he can be a guy who's viable depth for them, either at guard or I don't see him as a tackle, but the Giants have used him there a little bit, or did last year a little bit. So very curious to see what they have with McKethan.
Yeah, and I think to me this is maybe the most obvious aspect, but part of the larger picture that we have to remember about the Giants is that the Giants are coming out of a very long period of poor personnel decisions, whether it be free agents or waiver claims or draftees, and really not, well, draftees, especially in the later rounds. That's a pet peeve of mine, but. And now all of a sudden we're getting excited because it looks like the Giants have added some really interesting players in the last couple of years. Some of the existing players have matured, and now naturally they made the playoffs last year, and people are hoping for more this year, and so on and so forth. But I think what you see in games like last night is that you don't rebuild a 53-man roster overnight. And the Giants seem to be a lot stronger at the top overall, and this is not just the offensive line, but overall, than they were a couple of years ago. But where you really see the damage from previous years, I think, is in the back end of the roster, where they just don't have the depth guys that other teams do. I mean, you look at Detroit, which has had a similarly bad record for a long time, but maybe started their rebuild a year earlier, I believe, than the Giants did with Campbell, I believe. They look farther along to me. It looks like they have more skill, especially they have more skill along both lines and more depth along both lines than the Giants have. And so that's something I think that worries me about the Giants this year. The season may go great as long as the starting players stay healthy, but once they start to go down with injuries, I'm not sure how much the Giants have to back a lot of these people up.
Yeah, it's it's interesting. It's people have to remember that, as you said, the Giants had a surprisingly good year in 2022. but they are not a finished product. I believe that the roster is better, overall. There is depth in some places, but I do think there's still work to be done. There's work to be done, on in the defensive backfield in terms of depth. There's work to be done at linebacker and at edge. And you always need to continue to build offensive line talent. You really should never go an NFL draft cycle without drafting something along both of those lines. And that was a mistake that I know Dave Gettleman made at least once during his Giants tenure. You just, whether you think you've got, a starting group or not, you have to continue to add to that group. So the Giants are still a work in progress. That said, I do think there's better talent, along the roster, across the roster than there was when the Giants ended last season. So steps in the right direction, but it doesn't mean that the Giants are there yet. It doesn't mean that they've caught the Dallas Cowboys in terms of talent. They may have closed the gap a little bit on the Eagles, but they're not there yet. They're still steps away from getting to that point. So, but we'll see. We got 2 more preseason games, and we'll see if some more of those depth guys. And like I said, I'm interested in McKethan. I was really happy last night on the defensive line with the play of Jordan Riley, guy who I had not seen much from. But to be honest with you, I don't know, when I think about it, what was I expecting? He's a 6'5", 325-pound nose tackle whose job is to swallow up double teams and hold the point of attack while doing it. And what was I expecting to see in shorts and T-shirts? But since the pads have come on, you begin to see he doesn't make a ton of plays. He doesn't make a ton of tackles. He's not always in the quarterback's face on passing plays. But when you try to run the ball up the middle, he swallows that double team. At least last night, what we saw was he doesn't get moved, and that allows the guys around him to make plays. And at the very basis of it, that's a nose tackle's job.
Yeah. And I thought he looked nice the little bit I watched him last night while he was in there. I thought he looked better than expected. And I mean, right, to be honest, though, after saying all these negative things about the back end of the Giants roster, there are a couple of guys at the back end of the who were at the back end of the Giants roster, who I think have moved up quite a bit over time. And you mentioned the defensive backfield, and at some point I assume you going to want to talk about that. But that's one place where they're getting some production from unexpected sources.
Well, I think let's talk about the defensive backfield a little bit, and we obviously have to talk about Jason Pinnock. And I know there's been a ton of gnashing of teeth all through the offseason about why couldn't the Giants pay Julian Love, and why didn't they bring Julian Love back? And it's a salary cap league, people. At some point in time, at certain positions, you have to look at the talent that you have on the roster. You have to look at the young players you have on the roster and think, okay, I could sign this player for $4 million a year, or I could go with this young player on a rookie contract who is really deserving of a starting opportunity. And that's what the Giants are doing with Jason Pinnock. And Jason Pinnock is showing you why the Giants moved on from Julian Love. Dane Belton, I think, showed some improvement last night. Undrafted free agent Alex Cook is a guy that I probably neglected to put to give a kudos in my kudos and wet willies after the game. He's a guy that Emery Hunt loves. Emery Hunt, a football game plan, good friend of good friend of the podcast, but Emery loves Alex Cook, and I think Alex Cook showed you that he can probably make the practice squad last night. So, so I think that give the organization and the coaching staff some credit for knowing what they had.
Yeah, and of course you didn't mention one back of the roster player, and that's Trey Hawkins, who
we haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, who nobody thought in round 6 that he was going. Everybody said developmental. Well, he's developed pretty fast, apparently.
Yeah, and you did your piece, and I've said this. You did your piece on rookie cornerbacks, and whether or not they can be successful in the NFL, and I've talked about it a little bit as well. It's not easy to play cornerback in the NFL. It's not as easy, to be honest with you, as Tay Banks and Trey Hawkins made it look last night. If the Giants are going to go with those guys on the outside, and I think they will, maybe not full time, I think they will when the matchups warrant it. When they play teams like Dallas, where CeeDee Lamb is your slot guy, where the best receiver on the other team is the slot guy, I think you'll see a lot of that.
Yeah.
But they're going to be up and down, but they're both showing that they can play. Yeah.
So, I mean, Hawkins was, I think, a complete surprise to just about everyone. And he looked great last night in the times when the camera found him. It seemed to me he had nice tight coverage most of the time, was not getting beat by receivers, and everything that's been coming out of training camp about how well he's played, it carried over to the game last night. And so I think it's becoming more and more likely. I mean, by the end of the game, I'm thinking, okay, what's the lineup week 1 against Dallas? And you got to pick 3 guys to handle CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, and Brandon Cooks, which is an imposing trio of guys. And I'm thinking, well, why not put Adoree Jackson on CeeDee Lamb and let Banks and Hawkins handle Cooks and Gallup in some order. I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me if the Giants did that right off the bat in game 1, because I thought Hawkins in his first game action looked great, and I thought Deonte Banks looked good too. I understand that he almost gave up a touchdown that Jameson Williams dropped.
But I would argue that Banks had something to do with that drop.
That's what I was going to say. It's not obvious to me that Jameson Williams just dropped that because Banks had his hand in there, and he was right on Jameson Williams' back too. So I mean, the first thing that I think you want to see from a defensive back is that he's not getting beat. And we saw, clips on Twitter during the early part of training camp. There was one clip of Darren Waller putting a move on Banks and blowing right past him, and Banks was 5 yards behind after a couple of seconds. You say, oh my God, that's terrible coverage. And you saw him being beaten consistently, I think, early in camp. But my sense of things, not being at camp myself to know for sure, but my sense of things from what I see is that he's improved as camp has gone on. And when I was watching him last night, I thought that play in particular, I thought he had, whether he touched the ball or not, I think he at least made it difficult for Jameson Williams to do that. And Jameson Williams is a guy who should have been a first-round draft pick a year ago, where it was not for his injury. And so he's somebody who could turn into royalty in the NFL if he manages to catch the ball well, because he certainly got the talent. And I thought, again, when the camera found Banks, I thought I saw him keeping up with receivers and going stride for stride with receivers most of the time I was watching him. And so I'm starting to get this sense of Banks as a guy who just needed some acclimation, but as he's starting to get used to things, he's getting more and more comfortable, and maybe his raw talent is starting to show through. And so I'm going to be anxious to see as we go week to week and month to month whether I see further improvement from him, and maybe by the end of the season, maybe by midseason even, he becomes the guy that you thought that he might be when the Giants took him in the first round. And if that can happen, and if Hawkins can actually be a quality corner on the opposite side, then that's an amazing thing for the Giants defense.
Yeah, that's a huge bonus. And the last thing I would say about those two young men, Trey Hawkins missed a tackle last night, but I have said for years, I've said again and again and again, if you don't come into the NFL knowing how to tackle, being willing to tackle, being able to tackle, you're not going to learn how to do that in the NFL just because of the way practices are now. You never do it. And both of those young men can tackle on the outside, and that's another somewhat overlooked but really important positive thing as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I feel that what we're seeing from both of them so far is more than what we've seen from any cornerback in training camp preseason, more than we've seen from any cornerbacks the Giants have drafted in a few years now. So I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe they finally have the guys they need back there, and it's such an important part of a Wink Martindale defense that the cornerbacks not get beat immediately.
I also thought we've talked a lot about the depth, and obviously preseason game like last night is a lot about the depth players. One of the places we keep talking about depth for the Giants, and I still think they'll be looking at the waiver wire when cuts get made, later this month at the end of the preseason. But edge guys last night, a bunch of edge guys had good nights. Tomon Fox had a lot to do with that one interception, with the Pinnock interception. Habakkuk Baldonado, was a force coming off the edge in the second half, and shoot, he busted out the Justin Tuck bow.
Yeah, that's right.
and even Tayshawn Bauer made some plays. Yeah. So and it's not to say that maybe that the Giants definitely have the answers there, but if Tomon Fox in particular takes a step forward from last year, then maybe that need isn't as bad as we thought.
Yeah, and I've been worried about the edge position. I agree with you completely. I've been worried about the edge position for a while now, because although I like both DeVito and Aziz, that you're just one injury away from having to get into that depth. And Tomon Fox is someone that, I don't want to get too excited about him, but he looks like a pretty decent player. And I don't know where you put Jihad Ward in all of this, but I mean, Jihad Ward is kind of a part-time edge, part-time inside, part-time everywhere kind of guy. But Tomon Fox at this point looks to me like edge 3 on the depth chart, and I don't want to conclude too much off of one performance, but to me, he seems to have moved ahead of O'Shane Ximenez. And I liked Baldonado last night too, and I was happy to see that, because I thought he was the one guy besides Bryce Ford Wheaton who really looks like he needs to be a practice squad guy. Does not look like he's a 53-man roster caliber player yet. But Baldonado was the other guy that they took as undrafted free agent that I was intrigued by a little bit, since they didn't draft an edge, and I liked the way he looked last night. I thought the penalty that was called on him was a terrible call for the penalty, and I didn't think he did anything bad at all.
Yeah, maybe there was a touch of helmet to helmet there, yeah. But I thought that's just typical NFL overprotective of quarterbacks. But
exactly.
You mentioned Bryce Ford Wheaton. And that leads us to talking about a couple of things that maybe we didn't like last night, other than offensive line play. And, ever since the Giants signed Bryce Ford Wheaton, there has been a drumbeat of Giants fans thinking, oh, there's no way that the Giants can try to pass him through to the practice squad. There's no way they can waive him because somebody will claim him and put him on their 53-man roster, and he has to be on the roster spot. He has to be on the 53. Sorry, folks. There were, I think, 32 or 33 wide receivers drafted in the 2023 NFL draft. Bryce Ford Wheaton was not one of them. He runs fast. He jumps high. He's got all kinds of physical skills, but he showed you why last night. He dropped a very catchable ball. He had an opportunity to make another catch on a deeper pass from Tommy DeVito that he didn't make. He committed a very, very obvious offensive pass interference penalty. I love the guy's athleticism and his physical tools too, but he is no more than a practice squad player at this point in time. And I absolutely think that he showed that last night.
Yeah, I think it's the first time I've ever seen him in action myself. I never watched any of his games at West Virginia is where he
right.
Right. Yeah. So I never watched any of his games. It was the first time I've seen him, and I just thought this is a guy who's got all the physical skills, but doesn't really know how to play football yet, or doesn't know how to play football well yet, I should say. And you reminded me a little bit of a much more heralded wide receiver, Quentin Johnston. Who's now with the Chargers. Another guy who's got lots of physical tools, but I question how good a football player he is right now. I mean, they're different ends of the spectrum because Quentin Johnston has amazing physical skills,
and he's a first-round pick.
Right? He was a first-round pick, right. But I thought I saw some of the same. Here's somebody who doesn't know how to use the physical skills that he's got yet to play football well. And the flip side of that, though, is something else that occurred to me last night. And, one of the things I think that all of us in fandom do all the time is we notice free agents that are out there at positions of need for the Giants and say, oh, why don't the Giants sign this guy? Why don't the Giants get that guy? And so on and so forth, right? The latest one was Justin Houston, right? And people are looking for the Giants to pick up an edge, and there's still well-known edge players out there, Jadeveon Clowney and so on and so forth. But I think the thing that I've concluded about Joe Schoen is that he will sign veteran free agents, but only ones at the low end of the cost spectrum. And he's not going to go after big ticket free agents unless he'll pick his spots. I mean, he did that with Okereke, for example, but for the most part, he's not going to go after free agents that are going to cost him more than a couple of $1 million. That having been said, he will, you'd say, well, look at how much depth the Giants have at wide receiver. Even without Bryce Ford Wheaton, assuming he goes to the practice squad, you see how much depth they have at wide receiver and the difficult decisions that they're going to have to make. Why is he going and signing these veteran players like Cole Beasley and Jamison Crowder? Well, you saw last night these veteran possession receivers who he gets for about $1 million and change, they can still play ball. And if you watch, the passing last night, those were the guys that DeVito was going to when he needed to make a play. And so, that type of veteran presence on a team can really be valuable if you can get them for a low price. Whether either or both of them will actually make the 53, I have no idea, but they both can still play.
Absolutely. I know people were interested this week when the Anthony Barr rumors started, and in the end there was no visit to New Jersey by Barr, and I think what Joe Schoen said was, I want to spend the preseason looking at the young players that we have. You're looking at the young edge guys that we've talked about, looking at the undrafted inside linebackers, the guys like Troy Brown and Deontay Johnson. What will happen is there's one cut this year from 90 to 53 at the end of the preseason. If Joe Shane and the Giants think a move needs to get made, think a veteran needs to get added, there's going to be a lot of guys, a lot of experienced players available at that point in time. And that's when he'll make a move. It won't be a hugely expensive move, but it'll be, it'll be a move for a veteran player who can come in and give you some adequate play. And I think that's what I would expect. The other thing that I wanted to mention, Tony, before we wrap it up is last night was a preseason game. The final score didn't matter. But, don't tell any of that to Brian Daboll. Brian Daboll, first preseason game or not, Brian Daboll got himself worked up. He got into faces of some offensive linemen, and he gave Thomas McGahee the absolute death stare after that 94-yard punt return. And you got to love Daboll.
Well, Daboll is such a fascinating character, I have to admit, right? Because, his players love him. I believe everything suggests that he obviously cares about them, and he's put a lot of thought into how to be a good head coach, not only from a nuts and bolts standpoint, but how to relate to players and get the most out of players. He cares about what the players think. He wants the players to give him input on what they like to do, the favorite plays, and and so on and so forth. But then on the sideline, you see this other side of him where the full moon comes out and he turns into the wolf man and just does absolutely bonkers on guys who've made bad plays.
He admits that he sort of blacks out when he does that, and he doesn't even remember what he said to people half the time. But I will say this. I've watched enough Giants practices this year. I haven't been at every one, but I've watched enough Giants practices this year that what has been really, really interesting to me, Brian Daboll yells at his coaches more than he yells at his players. He yells at his coaches more than his players. He is absolutely all over the coaching staff during these 11-on-11 periods. If they can't get the substitutions in properly, if they don't get guys on and off the field, if they don't get the right personnel in the game. And I kind of like it because, a lot of those things, the substitutions, the personnel packages, how quickly you get a play into the quarterback or how quickly you get the defense into whoever's wearing the microphone on defense. Those things matter. And I kind of love the fact that he's holding his coaches to a high standard.
Yeah. And I have to think, if you're one of the players watching that happen, it's actually, in its own strange way, it's a positive thing, because the vibe, I guess, then on the sideline is not that it's the coaches versus the players and something bad happens.
Absolutely.
And the coaches are all descending on the players, but rather it's Daboll being an equal opportunity blaster of anyone that he thinks has not done the right thing, and the coaches aren't immune to it either. And the players have to, I think, feel at least a little good about that they're not always being picked on by the head coach. But of course, I mean, he'll yell at the players plenty too. I mean, he was on that offensive line earlier in the game when they didn't do something. Remember back in game one last year, after Daniel Jones threw the interception in the fourth quarter, he immediately lit into Daniel Jones. But then he kind of let up and said, "Well, what did you see?" And Jones told him. So they said, "Well, that's not what I saw." And then he just went on from that. And so I kind of like how he does that, and I think it shows his passion for the game. The only thing I say to myself when I see him doing one of those things is, okay, don't have a heart attack. Your weight isn't where it's supposed to be.
No, which he admits, by the way.
Yeah.
I saw, what did they showed a photo last night of Brian Daboll and Dan Campbell about 10 years ago, when I think both guys were on the Miami Dolphins coaching staff.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I looked at that picture of Brian Daboll and I thought, not only is that a younger face, but that's about half of the guy that coaches the Giants right now.
Whereas Dan Campbell might be pretty much the same weight he was when he was a tight end for the Giants.
Absolutely. Anyway, Tony, appreciate the time. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Giants fans, thank you as always for listening. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.